Good afternoon and welcome to Playing Politics. I'm Ashley Gillen. Here in Canberra, debate is continuing to rage about the government's emissions trading scheme and the contentious issue of asylum seekers. Coming up on the program today, we'll be covering off those two issues with our guest commentators, the Independent MP Tony Windsor and GetUp's National Director Simon Sheikh. First though, we're going to be starting with the Liberal MP and former Immigration Minister Kevin Andrews. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ashley.
We've heard a lot of debate about how the government is handling the issue of asylum seekers, but as the alternative government, what is the coalition's stance on this? Are temporary protection visas still part of the party's policy?
Well, this is the government's responsibility. I mean, Mr Rudd said prior to the last election he would turn back the boats. So the ball is in his court. He's the Australian Prime Minister. He shouldn't be looking to what everybody else around the world can do, but his responsibility is to the people of Australia. John Howard said that we'll determine who comes to Australia. Kevin Rudd's saying the Indonesians can determine who comes to Australia.
But as the coalition, you have a responsibility, if you're going to be attacking the government over this issue, to also have your own policy stance. Back in April, you said that the coalition is still in favour of temporary protection visas. Is that still the case?
Look, there's a range of potential policies that we could put in place, that Australia could put in place. But we're not in government. Mr Rudd's in government. He has got the ball in his court, but he doesn't want to act on it. He says on one hand, I'm acting tough, but when it comes to action, he doesn't want to do anything. He's up there in Indonesia saying to the Indonesians, pleading with the Indonesians, can you do something? As I said, he's saying to the Australian people, even though I'm your elected Prime Minister, the Indonesians can decide who comes to Australia.
You're in charge of you're leading the team in the coalition looking at new policy development areas. Are you personally pushing for the coalition to keep TPVs? Do you think personally that that is the right way to go?
We'll have a discussion, but one has to look at what worked and what didn't work. In the past, there were a set of policies that were put in place that worked. We stopped the flow of boats to Australia to a trickle. Now, since then, in the last 2 years, we've seen that flow of boats continue. 41 boats, 2,000 people in the last 12 months or so. Now, the real question is, what is Kevin Rudd doing? He was elected as Prime Minister of Australia. Unfortunately, I have to say to Mr Rudd, if you're the Prime Minister of Australia and you're ministers in the government of Australia, then the ball is in your court to make some decisions. And at the moment, he is simply running away from making decisions.
I do think it's important to clarify that you, as a senior Liberal, former Immigration Minister, whether or not you think that bringing back temporary protection visas would help to stem that influx.
Look, we're looking at a range of policies, and there are things there...
Which basically means, doesn't it, that you don't have a policy right now?
There are things there which the government can do. It knows there are things it can do, but it wants to say, no, this is all about the push factors, got nothing to do with any policy changes we made in Australia. Now, we're not going to let Mr Rudd off the hook. He's made policy changes. He said, naively I believe, negligently at worst, that this would both be humane and stem the flow. Now, the reality, it's been neither, because we've had deaths, and secondly, we haven't stemmed the flow. So the ball is clearly in his court to say to the people of Australia, as Prime Minister, what he would do to stop this occurring.
So what would you do right now to stop it?
Well, I'm not the Minister at the moment. When I was the Minister, I took the responsibility for the decisions I made, just as the government took the responsibility. Right now, Mr Rudd is Prime Minister, Senator Evans is the Minister. They just want to run away from this issue as fast as they can.
There is a report today in the West Australian that Indonesia could be offered millions of dollars to intercept and house asylum seekers who attempt to make the journey to Australia, almost like incentive payments for either each boatload or each person. The details are very fuzzy at this stage. But is that sort of scheme a good idea?
Well, two things. Firstly, there's been cooperation between Indonesia and Australia for many, many years. When I was the Minister, I visited Indonesia, I talked with senior officials in Indonesia, and there is cooperation. But Indonesia's also got a problem that it doesn't want to have to deal with Australia's problem. And the reality here is that, as I said, instead of saying, well, we'll determine who comes to Australia, we'll determine our response to this, Mr Rudd wants to handball the whole thing to the Indonesians. Now, he desperately rang the President of Indonesia saying, can you stop this boat? Can you turn around this boat? Why doesn't he do something? I mean, after all, he's been elected to the highest office in this land, and the responsibility that comes with that position is actually to make some tough decisions. Talking tough is just nonsense. Do something.
But didn't the Pacific Solution also handball some of those issues over to other countries in the region?
Well, we took responsibility for the decisions we made, and that stopped the flow. Now, Mr Rudd is not prepared to take responsibility, is not prepared to make decisions, and I think the Australian people can see through him for that. I mean, he was all bravado prior to the election. Yes, I'll stop the boats coming to Australia. Well, he hasn't done it. Now, the sad reality for public officials is that you're judged not on your rhetoric or on your promises or on your aspirations. You are judged according to what the outcomes are. And so far the outcomes are 41 boats, 2,000 people have come. What was a trickle has become a flood.
Of course, the Rudd government is blaming push factors, things like increasing violence in places like Sri Lanka.
Well, the war in Sri Lanka is over. But interestingly, they also say that Afghanistan is one of the countries in which there are...
very unstable.
Well, it's still unstable, but the war in Sri Lanka is over. What are they doing in terms, the government doing, in terms of assisting the Sri Lankans now to bring about a lasting peace in that country? That would be something that should be done. But secondly, I'll take this point about Afghanistan, because Mr Rudd was mentioning Afghanistan as one of the major countries with a push factor. Yet overnight, we hear that Senator Faulkner is contemplating withdrawing troops more quickly from Afghanistan. So he says on one hand, oh, this is a major country with a push factor, but yet they're saying, oh, well, we'll pull our troops more quickly out of Afghanistan. You can't have it both ways.
What about the debate about the language we've seen used to describe asylum seekers? Should they be called illegal immigrants? Does that concern
Well,
you?
I've tended to use the word unlawful rather than illegal, but when people use words
Is there
like...
a big difference?
Well, technically there are differences, but when people are using this language, they're describing what the ordinary person in the street understands. They're saying, this is somebody who's coming here in a way which is not the proper channels to come to Australia. And whether people use illegal or unlawful, I think that's common language, so that's what it depicts.
If Christmas Island does run out of room, where do you think asylum seekers should be processed?
Well, they will have to find somewhere else. I mean, the irony of this is that when we built Christmas Island, Mr Rudd and the Labor Party was saying this is a white elephant. This was a waste of money to build Christmas Island and the new facility. Now the place looks like it's overflowing because of their policies. They're going to have to find somewhere else to house these people. Either that, or they're just going to give them a fast passage into Australia.
Is Darwin the right place, though, to look
Well,
for
look,
next?
there's a number of places. I mean, the Port Hedland camp has now been used by the mining industry, so it would be very difficult, and there's a shortage of accommodation there. This is a case where, if it comes to this, and unfortunately it looks like it will, they will have to find some alternative accommodation.
I'm sure we'll hear more about this issue in Question Time today, so we can all look forward to another fiery one on that. I do want to ask you about a speech you made yesterday
Yes.
about population challenges facing Australia. You said that there's no rationale for the policy of bringing more and more people to Australia, and you criticised the levels of migration we've seen under the Rudd government. Didn't immigration levels also rise under your time?
Yeah, it's true they rose under the Howard government, but they've increased even further under the Rudd government. I mean, they announced that we were going to have 190,000 migrants to Australia. Now, they cut that back subsequently, but it's still higher than levels before. My point is this: our roads are congested, our public transport is overcrowded, our water supply is inadequate, our amenity is under threat, yet there's no rational policy about population for Australia.
But you're not arguing we stop immigration.
No, I'm saying the starting point for immigration is what is the replacement level of our population. That is,